In a condemnation case, it's necessary to work with experts to help determine the amount of just compensation. Obviously, real estate appraisers are key, but other types of experts are used in different scenarios. For example, in agricultural cases, it may be necessary to work with experts in drain tiles or irrigation issues like pivots. It may be necessary to work with experts who can quantify business interruption damages or who can value different types of property like fixtures. This post is going to focus on two examples where I worked with civil engineers, one early in my career and one just last year, in partial taking cases to help substantiate significant diminutions in value attributable to takings. We're in Cadillac, Michigan. Highest and best use is one of the key concepts that must be applied when valuing property in eminent domain. Highest and best use requires an appraiser to look at factors like whether a use is legally permissible, for example, consistent with zoning, whether it's physically possible, for example, it has the appropriate topography or utility features to allow it to be developed, and whether it is maximally productive. It doesn't matter if a property owner, in this case, a farmer, wants to continue farming. When the property is valued, it must be valued to its highest and best use. Since this property is actually located within the city limits with access to utilities, its highest and best use was for some form of development. This is Highway 131. This is what was built and split the farm. You can see the city side over here with a water tower in the cornfields. That still had access to city utilities. We had to work with civil engineers to determine the cost of bringing those utilities underneath the freeway, including a pump station to bring it up to ground level on the other side of the freeway. It turned out to be cost prohibitive and required a significant reduction in value. We actually had to take this case to a jury trial. The jury awarded $710,000, approximately $300,000 more than what the Michigan Department of Transportation was offering. Everybody was pretty happy with that result, including me. It was my first jury trial back in 1998, and the judge told me it was the highest verdict that he had seen in the county that year. Next, we're going to go to a property in Washtenaw County where we engaged in more sophisticated civil engineering analysis to get the measure of damages on a piece of development property that was split by a pipeline. We're just outside of Chelsea on vacant land that was purchased for development. The property enjoyed very favorable zoning. It allowed a wide variety of uses: single family, multifamily, office, and commercial. The property was purchased for development, and Consumers Power came along and installed a new natural gas pipeline. A significant amount of the property was wetland, but there was plenty of property left for building. There were two primary problems with the acquisition of the easement. Number one, Consumers was forced, for permitting purposes, to avoid as many wetlands as possible and therefore put its pipeline through much of the uplands. Second, Consumers' easement did not allow any construction through a wide swath of property. I worked with a civil engineer and an appraiser. The civil engineer delineated the wetlands on the property. The appraiser undertook market analysis to identify what types of uses would best be suited on the property. The engineer then took that information and did a layout of how the property could be constructed before the taking. He identified what roads were needed, the distances between the driveways, what setbacks were required, and where the buildings could go. In doing so, he identified the total amount of commercial development that occurred on the road frontage and residential development that occurred in the rear of the property. He also evaluated the costs that would be incurred to develop that property in terms of site plan work, permitting, and other things like that. The civil engineer's work was quite sophisticated. He undertook the same process after the taking. He was then able to identify the loss of yield in terms of commercial square footage building or the loss of the various units that could be constructed for residential purposes. He was also able to identify that the costs on a per foot or per unit basis increased because of the need to lay the property out differently, run longer roads to cross over the easement, to protect the pipeline where the roads crossed over it. The appraiser then took that information and recognized that it was not just a straightforward percentage diminution that should be applied. For example, it was not a 1-to-1 ratio of 20% of the units are lost, therefore the property is diminished in value by 20%. Rather, because of the increased cost and because the design was no longer as attractive after the taking, he applied a more significant diminution of value. I can't tell you what the case settled for because Consumers Power required my client to sign a confidentiality agreement. I can say that everybody was quite happy, and my client and our wives went out for a big steak dinner in Ann Arbor to celebrate. Having civil engineers involved in these cases was obviously necessary to bring them to their successful resolutions. In my experience, I've worked with many civil engineers on a wide variety of issues, and I like to be able to bring that knowledge to the table to help you with your case.